From WABE in Atlanta, this is Savory Stories, a show where we take a look at Atlanta's people through its cuisine and food history.
On this podcast, we trace Atlanta's food story from the past to the present, getting to know Atlanta's culinary creators and demystifying stereotypes about food.
I'm Akilah McConnell, culinary historian and owner of Unexpected Atlanta Tours, the #1 rated Atlanta tour and activity on TripAdvisor, and author of A Culinary History of Atlanta.
And I'm Chef Asita Reed, owner of Life Chef, where we help you live a life you love, and author of How to Feed a Kid, A Parent's Guide. Today, we're talking politics, but not on the issues or the candidates. Instead, we're talking about what we eat when we vote and foods historically associated with elections.
Asita, I have to tell you, I love this topic. I am a total election watcher. I stay up late. I watch all the votes coming in. And I have to say, the last couple of years when Georgia has become so crucial to the elections, I have a really big annoyance. It is the way that the television producers pronounce DeKalb County.
Oh, gosh, yes. That hard L kills me every time. Where's DeKalb?
It's not DeKalb. It's not DeKalb. It's not DeKalb. None of those things. It's DeKalb. But you know, Asita, food has a lot to do with elections.
I don't really think of food in elections, so illuminate.
Okay, so politicians try to resonate with all of us. And one of the best ways to resonate with the populace is to eat the foods that we love. So it is no surprise that in 2024 alone, former President Trump stopped in at a Chick-fil-A at an Atlanta rally. Vice President Harris ate at Paschal's restaurant. And one of the interesting things is that though American politics are really divided, food isn't partisan. Both President Trump and Vice President Harris were eating fried chicken at these restaurants. And as you know, we really, really love our fried chicken here in Atlanta.
We definitely do. But how did this connection between food and politics even begin?
At the very beginning. So George Washington, our first president, was actually the first to effectively use food and drink to sway voters. If you've listened to our episode on barbecued, in the 1758 election for the House of Burgesses, Washington threw a huge barbecue where he purchased 28 gallons of rum, 50 gallons of rum punch, 34 gallons of wine, 46 gallons of strong beer, and 2 gallons of cider royale for the 391 voters in his district. That is about a half gallon of alcohol per voter. So the idea was to get voters fed, drunk, and voting. And by the way, George Washington won that election.
I bet he did, but it's a wonder they could even stand up long enough to vote with that much booze flowing.
Well, the funny thing is that it was a little tough for them. This concept of buying constituents food and drink was known as treating. That was the term. It was a super popular practice in the 1700s and 1800s. In the show notes, I've actually provided a link to a painting by George Bingham in 1852 that is called County Election. You can see that a whole lot of the people are having a hard time standing while they're voting because the campaigns were all treating the voters with alcohol.
I like treating. It sounds so much nicer than bribing.
It was definitely bribing. But in a young Atlanta, treating was a very common practice. So our very first election, I don't think I've ever told this story before, and it's such a good one.
Ooh, do tell.
So it was between a young beer still manufacturer named Moses Formwalt and the older, more respectable businessman, Jonathan Norcross. Now, Moses Formwalt was a member of the Free and Rowdy political party. And yes, that was the literal name of the political party.
Free and Rowdy.
Free and Rowdy. And Norcross, on the other hand, was a member of the Morals Party. Also, yes, the literal name of the political party. So at that first election, Formwalt treated his voters with free beer and other alcohol. Norcross treated his voters with apples and candies.
Oh, well.
Yeah, guess who won that election?
I'm going to go, just wild guess, that Free and Rowdy won that one by a long shot.
You got it. Moses Formwalt of the Free and Rowdy Party was our first mayor. And, side note here, I don't understand why one of our many Atlanta breweries doesn't make a beer called Free and Rowdy, or even one named after Formwalt. That would be the perfect beer name, right?
That is a brilliant idea. Maybe we can convince our friends over at Wildhaven or Twain's to take on that project.
I like it.
Yeah. And if any of our listeners are interested in local brews, make sure you check out our previous episode on local breweries. But back to this connection between politics and food.
Okay, so food was not just a method of bribery via treating. It was also a way for politicians to connect with the mass population. When you really think about it, we mostly see politicians sitting behind desks or podiums giving speeches. But when we see them eat, they become more human and we connect with them. And this began, from the very founding of our country.
That reminds me of the episode of Parts Unknown where Anthony Bourdain and President Barack Obama were sharing a meal and some beers over in Hanoi, Vietnam. I mean, here are two men from two different worlds, but they're sitting there with their sleeves rolled up, sharing a small table, crowded with food, slurping noodles, and popping chunks of pork into their mouths with chopsticks. I mean, how much more human and relatable can you be? They're both so real and unarmed in that moment. The story of how that episode came to pass is really interesting, so we'll post a link in the show notes of the director's cut so everybody can check that out. It's a pretty cool story.
It's a great episode. That episode is such an interesting one, and the idea of them both sitting at this little humble shop in Vietnam, it's really a cool episode.
It kind of illustrates your point that, politicians have to be human and relatable, and sitting down and having a bite with somebody else who's like the icon of relatability. Perfect look. But anyway, take us back to the 1800s, Akilah.
Yeah, so they were doing this exact same thing, this relatability concept back in the 1800s. For example, in 1840, William Henry Harrison, he defeated then President Martin Van Buren by stressing, and I quote, his humble log cabin and hard cider heritage. And he followed that up by treating voters to hard cider. Now, beginning in the early 1900s, states began banning treating, and in particular using alcohol to influence voters. These bans weren't so much on the bribery side, but actually more with this larger push against alcohol during the Prohibition movement. But over time, it did become a matter of ensuring that elections were not being influenced by these foods and drinks. In 1948, the United States banned any kind of rewards, no matter how nonpartisan, for voting when federal candidates are on the ballot. And the Federal Election Commission, or the FEC, takes it really seriously. For example, in 2008, Ben & Jerry's tried to give away free ice cream scoops to anyone who showed a voter sticker, but the FEC told them that they were running afoul of the law. Ben & Jerry's had to change it to offering free scoops for everyone on voting day.
In one of our earliest episodes on City Lights, Food and Resistance episode, we interviewed Deborah Scott, who's CEO of Georgia Stand Up. And Georgia Stand Up ended up hosting block parties for voters during the last election cycle. But one of the things that they had to learn was how to legally celebrate and support voters who had faced really long lines at the polls with water and food. But they had to learn how to do it in a way that did not run afoul of the FEC.
Yeah, and Asada, that actually goes back to this whole concept of treating that was banned. So the laws around this are very complicated, and it's ones that are continuing to be untangled. So in politics, food is not just sustenance, but it's actually emblematic of bigger concepts. So hat tip here to Alex Prudhomme and his recent book, Dinner with the President, Food, Politics, and a History of Breaking Bread at the White House. He begins the book with a famous event that I am sure you have heard about. That's when Thomas Jefferson enticed the quarreling Alexander Hamilton and James Madison with a sumptuous meal and they were trying to decide where to build a new capital city. Known as the dinner table bargain over fine French wine, beef braised in red wine and herbs, and root vegetables roasted in olive oil, the three men decided to make the United States capital as Washington, D.C. And Asada, you might remember this event from the musical Hamilton.
Yes, that discussion is memorialized in that song, The Room Where It Happens.
So as this example shows, food is not just a way for politicians to connect to the populace, but also a way for them to connect to each other. Who deserves a seat at the table? And when they're at that table, what should they eat? By the way, if you're a total food history geek like me, you can actually find decades of White House event menus cataloged online. I've included the link to President George W. Bush's White House dinners. Now, President Bush, his chefs emphasized a lot of local American seafood like Chesapeake Bay crabs and wild game like roasted duck. You might think that given President Bush's home in Texas, he would prefer a lot of beef.
Oh, yeah, or a barbecue.
Yeah, but actually for Christmas every year, his White House served turkey.
Ah, nice and traditional.
Nice and traditional, that's right. Now, on the other hand, President Obama's White House staff usually served fresh ingredients from the White House kitchen garden, which was one of First Lady Michelle Obama's projects. So a lot more salads and things like that.
Yeah, that administration was very much health-focused.
That's right. Now, President H.W. Bush, he never served broccoli because he famously hated broccoli. President Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, also from Texas, he served tons of beef, tons of steak in his state dinners.
Interesting. It's interesting to see how their personalities were reflected in the White House menus. Listeners might also enjoy reading Walter Scheib and Andrew Friedman's White House Chef, 11 Years, 2 Presidents, 1 Kitchen. And the book goes behind the scenes from Scheib's audition through state dinners and even feeding exhausted security staff during 9/11. Food really brings humanity to political issues. How has that link between food and politics played out here in Georgia, Akilah?
Well, Georgia's own President Jimmy Carter chartered a train to carry supporters and friends to his inauguration. The train was called the Peanut Special. A little note for you also. His Air Force One plane was known as Peanut One, and he also had Peanut Two, so he carried that peanut theme all the way through. Now, unsurprisingly, on the train, the Peanut Special, President Carter's chefs infused the menu with lots of Georgia favorites. To start, you could enjoy a peanut soup. For your entree, you could try baked sugar-cured Georgia ham with candied yams, or Southern fried chicken served with Georgia peach fritter. And of course, for dessert, you can enjoy those Georgia favorites, pecan pie or peach melba.
Okay, this needs to be reinstated as some sort of tourist attraction. Every time someone came into town, I'd have them on President Carter's dinner train.
Me too. It sounds absolutely delicious. And by the way, these elegant meals are not just reserved to the White House. Here in Georgia, we have given many sumptuous dinners for presidents. I want to share with you one of the most unusual Atlanta food stories that I have in my back pocket.
Ooh, this is going to be good. Okay.
It's one of my favorite stories, to be honest with you. So to set the stage, for centuries, a possum, which is formerly called possum when eaten, this was Georgia's most popular meat.
Really?
Yeah, forget about beef, chicken, all of that. It was possum. Initially eaten by the indigenous people, then the enslaved people, and also the poorer classes, possum was a really good substitute to a roasted turkey. Kind of has that similar flavor profile. However, when it is cleaned and cooked, it resembles nothing more than an enormous brown rat.
Yeah, it lacks in plate appeal.
Yeah, exactly. But by the late 1800s, possum was not just for the poorer classes. It was the preferred food for politicians and for lawyers. In fact, possum suppers were frequently eaten at Thanksgiving and Christmas. In 1874, one Atlanta wholesaler sold nearly 60 live possums every single day to the restaurants and grocers in the city.
Okay, if anyone is keeping this tradition alive, please reach out and let us know. I've heard the prep and cleaning of the possum is the most important part, because otherwise it tastes like chicken. But I can neither confirm or deny this. Akilah, have you tried possum?
I have not. But the story of possum is super interesting because it was a regional food. This was something that, here in the South, people ate, especially in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, these areas with a lot of trees. And, we've got a lot of possums here.
Yeah, makes sense. It's available.
But possum didn't reach the national stage until 1909 when President-elect Taft asked for possums to be served at the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce dinner at the Piedmont Hotel. The chamber requested 100 possums for the dinner, and recipes and dead marsupials arrived at the chamber offices as possum hunters from around the state sought the honor to have their meat served to the president-elect.
Wow.
So finally, on the day of the dinner, Taft was served an 18-pound barbecued possum with taters, or sweet potatoes, and Taft went after his possum as if he liked it. He apparently ate it so quickly that a nearby doctor advised him to slow down.
My man was grubbing on an 18-pound possum. That is a big possum.
It's the size of a dog.
That is a dog.
Small dog. A small dog. After the dinner ended, a group of Atlantans presented Taft with a small plush toy opossum, and they said this was going to replace Teddy Roosevelt's teddy bear.
It's a stuffy.
It's a stuffy.
Of a possum.
A stuffy of a possum. That is correct. I actually think it's kind of cute. I've put the example of what it looked like in the show notes. There was even a company, Asta, formed called the Georgia Billy Possum Company. It churned out thousands of these stuffed possums in their first year, but then it folded.
Gee, I wonder why, Akilah.
So in later years, Franklin Delano Roosevelt continued Taft's fondness for possum. He even went on numerous possum hunts in his home in Warm Springs, Georgia. But the possum did fade after a while.
Yeah, even with all that PR and press, and even presidents, the possum still has a major publicity problem.
Yeah, it ended up going out of vogue in the 1930s, partially because Herbert Hoover had a pet possum.
Oh, my goodness.
A live pet possum that roamed around the White House.
Mm-mm.
But, the idea, as you can see, was that Taft wanted to show that he had a connection with the mass populace. And he was showing that by eating one of the most popular Atlanta foods of the time, which was the possum. And that brings us back to our examples at the beginning of this podcast episode when we talked about President Trump going to Chick-fil-A and Vice President Harris going to Paschal's, and both of them eating fried chicken.
Right.
The foods might be different, but the motivation stays the same. These politicians come to Atlanta to eat the foods that are important to us to show that they connect with us.
But sometimes politicians get their food and their food etiquette all wrong, and that can have a negative impact, right?
Oh, yeah. And the best story associated with that is the Great Tamale Incident of 1976. In 1976, Gerald Ford was the Republican candidate, and Georgia's own Jimmy Carter was the Democratic candidate. Now, Ford went to campaign in Texas, and he was presented with a plate of tamales. But apparently he was not briefed properly on tamale etiquette, and he picked it up, and without unwrapping the corn husk, he bit straight into the tamale, nearly choking on the wrapper. For the rest of that weekend, every newspaper and TV show in Texas and much of the Southwest showed Ford not knowing how to eat a tamale.
Oof.
And because of that, Ford, a Republican, lost Texas to Carter, a Democrat. By the way, that 1976 election is the only time in the past 50 years that Texas has voted for a Democrat.
And that really shows, like, the personal offense every Texan took to this man not being able to eat a tamale properly.
That is right. If you want to be by the people, for the people, with the people, eat your tamales properly, right?
Absolutely.
And I got to say this, like, this is my advice to politicians coming to Atlanta. Don't come to Atlanta and eat your wings with a fork.
Oh.
No. And if you're coming here, do not put sugar in your grits.
Oh, goodness. Never.
What are some other do nots? You cannot do this if you come to Atlanta. What's going to be the next great tamale incident but in Atlanta?
I mean, you pretty much floored me with sugar in the grits. I'm going to need a moment to recover as I clutch my pearls. If you're putting sugar in your grits, you're not from Atlanta, and it shows. I don't even know if you're from the South. Maybe Tennessee, because they've got like a sugar bubble going on there.
You could be from Tennessee and eat your sugar in your grits.
Yes.
But if you're putting sugar in your grits, then you are coming from outside.
You're imported.
You're imported.
You're not even a Georgian, much less an ATLian.
On the other hand, if you don't put butter in your grits,
you're a heathen. No, we will not be putting sugar in the grits, and butter is mandatory. I don't care if you're vegan, you're going to put butter in your grits.
And biscuits. That's the other thing. Butter those biscuits, y'all.
Absolutely.
Politicians coming to Atlanta, butter your biscuits.
Butter your biscuits.
So speaking of political connections, Asada, you know that all the politicians are coming here to Atlanta. So share with us some restaurants where we might run into some candidates.
When politicians come to Atlanta, they love to hit up our famous and historic soul food restaurants. And that's probably because places like Busy Bee and Paschal's have deep roots in our city, dating all the way back to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. More recently, in 2019, Killer Mike and Bernie Sanders sat down to eat at Busy Bee's. We've discussed that in our Food is Justice episode on City Lights, so be sure to go back in the archives and check that out. Another Atlanta OG that gets a lot of political photo ops is Mary Mac's Tea Room, where the fried chicken is legendary. And when people want to get in touch with the real ATL, they show up at Chick-fil-A, Waffle House, and the Varsity. Places that are symbolic of today's Atlanta and have a lot of merch for swag. The AJC has quoted longtime Varsity employee Irby Walker, saying, "At the Varsity, you might see your garbage man, or you might see the governor. Those chili cheese dogs are the great equalizer in this city."
That is right. And that's reminding me about Waffle House. I think this should be a political briefing. How do you order your hash browns when you go to Waffle House? Because if you don't have it right, that could be a real issue.
I agree. I am absolutely judging any candidate by their Waffle House order.
Yeah, I think this is what we need to know. What is your Waffle House order?
Agreed.
So if you watch politicians' social media, you're going to see them at many of Atlanta's most popular current restaurants, right? Yeah,
our own mayor, Andre Dickens, did a press conference in front of the beautiful restaurant back in 2023, and Vice President Harris ate at Slutty Vegan in the Old Fourth Ward.
So where should we go if we want to see election results, but maybe we don't want to necessarily run into the candidates?
Well, those who know go into the neighborhoods and they dine with their constituents at places like Manuel's Tavern. Here, locals gather to watch and discuss sports, local events, and of course, politics, often holding unofficial watch parties on election nights. According to Manuel's website, here, a doctor, a plumber, a lawyer, an electrician, a student, a journalist, a salesman, a politician, or a construction worker can feel comfortable, accepted for who they are, and known by their name or what they drink. Manuel's definitely gives that Cheers vibe, like the TV show, but in an Atlanta format.
I like that. So what about you listeners? Do you have a local restaurant where politicians pull up to meet the neighbors? Or where do you gather for watch parties and big news events? Visit us on Instagram and let us know. We'll see you in a few weeks with another episode.
Savory Stories is produced by Crystal Devone with additional production and editing from Scotty Crow. The series was created by Summer Evans and premiered on City Lights with Lois Reitzes. For more info, visit wabe.org/Savory Stories.
WABE.